Just because you think you're in love with someone doesn't mean that the relationship is good for you. Do you remember the abusive ex that I told you about in the first video of this series? Even if you don't remember or you didn't watch that video, the only important thing to know is that that relationship led me to my spiritual awakening. I wound up getting back into a relationship with him later in 2017 after tricking myself into thinking that since I had made so much progress in my own inner healing, he must have too, but boy was I wrong. We had been on and off again for a total of 6 years. He was always so good at convincing me that he had changed and that things would be different this time. He'd be on his best behavior for weeks or months, no matter how long it took, in order to get himself back into my good graces. But as soon as I let my walls down and fell back in love with Mr. Nice Guy, he changed back into the same scary monster I left months ago all over again, and usually an even worse version of himself than the beast I remembered previously. We ended up meeting each other at my cousin's wedding in 2013. I remember the very first time we hung out, I asked him what drew him to me out of all of my other girl cousins who were also single at the time, and he told me word for word, "I'm the lion. I always go after the weakest one in the pack." And I was like, what does that mean? And he said, "I could tell that you have a good heart. You're beautiful, but you don't know that you're beautiful. So that makes you the most vulnerable one." This should have been red flag number 1. People tell you exactly who they are, and I should have believed him the first time instead of looking past this very obvious sign. The only reason he pursued me was because he knew that I was too naive to question him, and had a low enough self-esteem to stick around no matter what BS he pulled on me. He wanted a guarantee of someone to come home to, while simultaneously sleeping around behind my back whenever he pleased. The first time we lived together, I ended up working multiple jobs in order to stay on top of the bills and buy groceries. We ended up living through an entire winter in one of the coldest areas in upstate New York without any heat because he was too cheap to fill it with oil. So we reverted to living in our bedroom for the season with a tiny space heater. Eventually, the hot water heater started malfunctioning in mid-January. The toilet kept overflowing with boiling hot water and poured from the faucets even when the knobs were turned off. So every time I needed a shower, I would have to walk outside in a towel and winter boots, descend a flight of stairs out in the negative 13-degree temperatures, and manually turn it on and off in the cellar. He would take my car on the weekends to go up to hunting camp, since he didn't have his own car until I bought him one a couple of years later, and he would leave me stranded at home for days without any cable, internet, or cell phone service. We lived in a very small town with a population of 240 people, and the only places I could go in walking distance was a gas station and a small family-owned restaurant. Anytime I actually did have access to my car and decided to take a trip home, he'd make me feel super guilty for wanting to see and spend time with my family and friends. He'd basically try to turn me against everyone I cared about by making fun of them and calling them names, and just saying anything that would make me feel insecure and like I was doing something wrong for having my own social life, all in an attempt to keep me isolated to himself. I remember the first night where things went from subtle psychological abuse to full-blown physical abuse. We were on our way home from dinner when he kept bringing up his ex-girlfriend periodically throughout the night. I finally asked him, "Are you still in love with her or something?" He slammed on the brakes and started screaming and calling me names. By the time we got home, the neighbors called the cops because he kept opening and slamming the car door, screaming at the top of his lungs, and making a huge scene. I thought I could get him to calm down once we got inside the house, but quickly regretted my decision. He ended up picking up one of my cats and throwing her into the kitchen wall before body slamming me into the door frame of our bedroom. By the time the cops arrived, he put on his fake calm demeanor, told them that the neighbors must have made a mistake, and then took off to his friend's house with my car, leaving me home alone all over again. That night should have been enough for me to leave, but I was an incredibly codependent people pleaser back then, and terribly confused by his sudden change in behavior. I thought maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe I was the one in the wrong by accusing him of being in love with his ex. I convinced myself that I was the problem. No matter where we went, he was constantly seen in public as the most charming guy. And he would even go out of his way to do really nice things for strangers and follow it up by saying, "I gotta keep up that good karma," despite his abusive behavior behind closed doors. He had a very grandiose sense of entitlement and called himself an alpha male. Generally speaking, anyone who has the audacity to label themselves as such is usually the most insecure person in the room. We worked together at the same factory, and literally everyone there absolutely loved him and thought that he was such an amazing and funny guy. Our supervisor even told me on a few occasions how lucky I was to be with him. He even went as far as giving out lap dances to random women at various weddings that we went to together because he was so obsessed with gaining the attention and praise from every woman in any room that he entered, and got off on making their partners jealous, including me. We were together for a few years by the time his brother got married, and he ended up ignoring me the entire day and night while chasing tail from all the single bridesmaids. And eventually we attended one of his cousin's weddings, and his brother pulled me aside at the end of the night and told me that I deserved better after seeing the way that he was all over different women trying to get them to fawn over him. No matter how many times I tried to bring up issues within the relationship, my needs, feelings, and concerns were constantly shut down. He'd tell me that I was thinking too deeply into things and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Or my personal favorite, this is who I am, take it or leave it, in order to avoid taking any accountability for his actions or behavior. He was like a bull in a china shop, both literally and metaphorically. He constantly broke things and never fixed or replaced them, including crashing my truck and even breaking out one of the back windows because he locked the key inside. Then just glued a janky piece of plexiglass over the frame with silicone and left handprints all over the door. Due to my insecurities and lack of self-worth, I always covered for him. There were a few occasions where he punched out the windshield on both of my vehicles, and anytime anyone asked what happened, I made up a lie that I was driving behind a dump truck or down a back road. And the only time I got called out was when a girl at work asked what happened, and she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I know exactly what happened. I've been in that kind of relationship before." I covered for him when he got pulled over by the police and even bailed him out of jail a couple of times. No matter what he did, it was never enough to deter me from continuing to try to make our relationship work. And it certainly didn't help that I had this delusional belief that if I just loved him hard enough, he'd finally see how amazing I was and give me the relationship that I truly deserved. The reality is, people like the one I'm describing never change. They don't have any reason to change when you give them chance after chance to screw you over. Instead, they just see you as easy to manipulate, and over time they get better at hiding their paper trail of betrayal through performing behind your back. I had no idea what version of him was going to walk through the door at any given moment. Depending on whether he drank beer or vodka, smoked weed, or did coke, he'd either be happy-go-lucky, smiling and joking around, or a zombie beast ready to rip my head off. It was the perfect amount of unpredictability for me to stay trapped in cycles of wishing and hoping for things to magically get better, when all it was really doing was mirroring my dysfunctional childhood of walking on eggshells, trying my hardest to gain the love and approval of my abusers. I always wound up apologizing to him for stuff that he was doing to me. Every time he got blackout drunk and abusive towards me, I'd have to tiptoe around him the next day until I found the gentlest way to bring it up to him. He would not only get angry, but downright rageful, and blame me as the one in the wrong for even bringing it up. He'd blame his past for why he was the way that he was, and tell me that I should just be more understanding of him, and would even say things like, "You know I can't control what happens when I drink." Whenever he'd spark up one of his drunken temper tantrums, it wasn't unusual for him to accuse me of cheating on him with my ex who lived on the other side of the country. Meanwhile, he'd run weed up to his ex-girlfriend at the drop of a hat, the same one that he got super defensive about when I asked if he was still in love with her. I would later learn that anyone who obsessively accuses you of doing something is actually doing it themselves. It's called projection. He'd constantly drink and drive and tell me that rules were made to be broken. He was the most destructive person I've ever met in my entire life, yet I still wore those rose-colored glasses like my life depended on it. He would constantly chip away at my confidence by calling me stupid and telling me that I would never make it as a photographer, and basically tried to convince me to give up on everything that was ever important to me in order to maintain control of my self-image so he could continue to use me as his emotional punching bag. He'd also threaten me by telling me that he was going to leave me, move out of state, and find someone new whenever he wasn't getting his way, knowing that it would trigger my abandonment wounds and make me try harder to get him to stay. Somehow he always had a way of making me feel safe from the rest of the world except from him. I didn't know it back then, but this is a telltale sign that you're definitely in an abusive relationship. At one point, I actually thought that I was going insane until I learned about gaslighting. Gaslighting is essentially when someone makes you question your reality through purposely deceiving you into thinking that your memory or perception of a situation is completely wrong. It's different than just flat out lying. When someone is lying, they eventually own up to the fact that no, you're totally right about XYZ. Whereas when someone gaslights you, they double down on their lie and even tell you that you have mental issues, you need to see a therapist, etc. It wasn't until after going no contact with my mother and practicing setting healthier boundaries in my other relationships that I realized how often he did this to me. It was practically second nature for him to casually tell me that I was the one who had issues and that I needed to get my brain checked out or put on meds. And although it was scary to finally recognize the truth of the situation, it was equally empowering, as I now finally understood the degree of manipulation that I had been dealing with all those years prior. Towards the very end of our relationship, I decided to open up about the fact that I had hid my addiction to chewing tobacco from him the entire time that we were together. It was my attempt to both clear the air and in hopes that he would finally admit his wrongdoings. One of the things that he fessed up to was the fact that he was using all of our rent money to buy drugs instead of mailing it out like he told me that he was doing every month, which is why he ended up getting kicked out shortly after I moved out of our first place together the first time that I broke up with him. He also half admitted to dozens of scenarios where he cheated on me. And I say half admitted because he carefully painted each one in a way that made it sound like he could have cheated but didn't. But I know he was lying, and it was his cute little way of relieving himself from all the shame and guilt that he had been carrying all those years. For instance, there were a few girls from his hometown that he brought back to his parents' house after a night of drinking, and he claimed that they slept in separate beds. I've seen this dude drink himself into oblivion and claim that he didn't remember a thing from the night before. Obviously, he was lying through his teeth. And if you happen to be in a relationship with a narcissist, pay attention to the things that they share with you, because they do tell on themselves. For example, he'd tell me all these elaborate stories, like one of his friends hooking up with some random woman during a boys' trip, and he'd purposely frame it to make it sound like it was one of the other guys and not him. If he could get me to buy the story and we could laugh together and judge one of his buddies, it was his way of half admitting his wrongdoings so that he could clear his conscience of guilt in order to do it again. And the crazy thing is that all of his friends had wives or girlfriends, so breaking guy code to tell me those stories never made sense to me. It wasn't until this very conversation, when he started sharing super specific stories that matched the old wives' tales, that I realized how stupid I was for having fallen for his tactics so many times. And the thing that really made me sick to my stomach was the fact that most of the women that he cheated on me with were people that we saw on a regular basis. It was like everyone was in on the joke except for me. Chasing my dreams and finally bringing to life the goals that I set out to achieve was a huge catalyst in me leaving him once and for all. I was finally at a point in my life and healing journey where I was more afraid of losing myself than losing him. In late 2019, I told him that it was time for me to finally listen to my intuition and end things once and for all. His exact response was, "You can't just blindly follow your intuition." I just laughed to myself, knowing that was his last-ditch effort at trying to gaslight me into thinking that I was making the wrong choice. The fact that he was blatantly trying to get me to disregard my own inner knowing was all I needed in order to know that I was absolutely making the right decision, and I never looked back again. I realized that I used to always fall for people's potential instead of taking them at face value and recognizing who they were choosing to be. This experience taught me to stop abandoning myself in order to keep toxic people in my life, and I finally started developing standards for the kind of relationship I was going to have in the future. I've also learned that if your partner tries to convince you that your standards are too high, you are definitely in the wrong relationship. The right relationship will bring out the best in you, and naturally draw out more of who you truly are and encourage you to grow even further into who you came here to be. The wrong relationship will bring out the worst in you and chip away at your confidence as you slowly shut off parts of yourself until you become nothing but a shell of a human so that they never have to grow themselves. I've already mentioned this earlier, but I feel it's important to mention it here again. If someone is obsessively accusing you of cheating, it's because they are the ones who are cheating. It may sound cliche or whatever, but honestly, once a cheater, always a cheater. Someone may beg for your forgiveness, but they will just get better at hiding it next time. A person needs to undergo deep inner transformation in order to stop being a cheater, and they need to want to stop being a cheater. Please don't gaslight yourself into thinking that you're going to fix them. You won't. The only way to know if a person is truly changed is that they will not only take full accountability for every bad thing that they've done to you, but they will also have done some serious inner work and will prove to you through repetitive action and consistent change of behavior that they have in fact changed for the better. And the exact same principle applies to a person who is narcissistic, abusive, a compulsive liar, a manipulator, an addict, an alcoholic, and any other unhealed version of a person. If they've already shown you that they are unwilling to change, it's time to move on and become the version of you who stops settling for less and finally hold the highest standards for yourself until someone comes along who treats you with the respect that you do deserve. Because whatever we don't work on within ourselves, we end up working out with other people, especially our partners. I realized that I kept going back to him because just like the relationship I had with my mother, all I wanted was for him to finally see my value and worth. Unfortunately, people who don't love themselves are incapable of loving other people. So every time I got back together with him, he would respect me less and less because he never actually proved that he had changed in any way, shape, or form. He got the reward without ever having to put in any work. People do not learn from their mistakes if they never have to face the consequences of their own actions. And people only change if and when they decide that they're sick of their own BS, not when someone else is. There are two types of people in this world: people who blame their past for their terrible behavior, and people who try to do better because of their terrible past. It's best to learn the difference and stay far away from the former. You'll know you're in the right relationship when you stop questioning whether or not you're in the right relationship. So if you keep sacrificing your own needs, wants, and values for a relationship of any kind, you're probably not a match. The only way to heal from an abusive relationship is to go completely no contact and focus on healing and loving yourself in every way possible. I was determined to never attract another partner like this into my life ever again. So I focused on healing deeper layers of my mother wounds, nurturing my inner child, and working on my self-worth and confidence. I took myself on dates and adventures, and ultimately dedicated myself to becoming my own best friend instead of relying on someone else, especially a guy, to validate my self-worth. I spent a lot of time in deep introspection and listened to a ton of content on narcissistic abuse in order to make sense of and process everything that I experienced, and worked on healing my codependency patterns and anxious attachment style in order to start becoming more secure within myself. In order to gain closure, I had to self-reflect on 3 very specific things: the kind of relationship that I thought I was going to have with him, the actual reality of that relationship, and the kind of relationship I was going to hold space for moving forward. Eventually, after about 6 months or so, I finally started going on little dates here and there to purposely create distance from his memory. It wasn't anything serious, but it was enough to prove to myself that there were other guys out in the world that I could easily get along with and who would be interested in getting to know me too. As horrible as this relationship was, I had to take accountability for the fact that I was the other half of the equation that kept going back all those 6 years. It took me a long time to forgive myself, but eventually I realized that I simply didn't know back then what I know now. And that has been the most important thing for me to remember in order to let go of feeling like I betrayed myself and finally take my power back from the situation. I'm grateful for this experience because it's exactly what led me to my spiritual awakening, and all of the lessons I learned are exactly what got me where I am today, here, sharing all this wisdom in hopes that it could help someone finally leave that abusive relationship and heal themselves too. People tell you exactly who they are. Believe them the first time. If you have to beg someone to treat you with kindness and respect, then they are not for you. Because if they wanted to, then they would. You deserve so much more than to be with someone who's willing to hurt you over and over again with absolutely no remorse for how their behavior is affecting you. At the end of the day, rather than focusing on how you feel about a person, the more important thing to ask yourself is, how does that person make you feel? If they don't make you feel the same way that you feel about them, then it's time to make the most loving decision that you will ever make, and choose yourself.